He thought humiliating her would entertain the room, but in less than a minute, he would wish he had never spoken her name. The chandelier light shimmered across polished marble floors as laughter floated through the air of Hawthorne's grand dining hall, a place where wealth didn't just speak, it echoed, loudly, unapologetically. Crystal glasses clinked, tailored suits brushed past silk dresses, and at the center of it all stood Richard Hawthorne, a man whose name alone could close deals and open doors across the East Coast. At 52, his silver-streaked hair and custom navy suit reflected decades of power, and tonight, like many nights before, he was the gravity holding the room together. Conversations bent toward him, eyes followed him, and when he laughed, others joined, whether they understood the joke or not. Just a few steps away, moving quietly between tables, was Emily Carter, 34, dressed in a simple black and white waitress uniform, her hair tied neatly at the back. She blended into the background so perfectly she might as well have been part of the decor. She carried a tray with steady hands, her posture straight but unassuming, her expression calm in a way that suggested she had learned long ago how to be invisible in rooms like this. "Miss, another bottle," a guest snapped without looking at her, barely lifting his eyes from his phone. Emily nodded softly. "Of course, sir," her voice barely rising above the hum of conversation. She turned, her steps measured, almost silent against the glossy floor, but for a brief second, just a fraction of a moment, her gaze drifted across the room and landed on something no one else seemed to notice. A grand piano sat near the far wall, black lacquer gleaming under soft golden lights, untouched, ornamental, like a forgotten promise. Her eyes lingered, not long enough to draw attention, just long enough to remember. Across the room, Richard noticed. Not the tray in her hand, not the uniform, the glance. His lips curved into a slow, amused smile, the kind that had preceded countless deals, and just as many humiliations. "You see that?" he murmured to the group gathered around him, gesturing subtly with his glass. "Our waitress seems fascinated by the piano." A few heads turned. A few smirks followed. "Maybe she thinks she can play," one of his associates chuckled, adjusting his cufflinks. Richard's smile widened, a flicker of mischief. No, control, settling in his eyes. "Well," he said, his voice just loud enough to carry, "why don't we find out?" The conversation around him quieted slightly, curiosity spreading like a ripple. Emily had just returned with the bottle when she felt it, the shift in the room. The subtle pause. The attention. "You," Richard called, not unkindly, but not kindly either. Just enough authority to make refusal feel impossible. Emily stopped. Slowly, she turned. "Yes, sir." "You were looking at the piano," he said, taking a slow sip of his drink. "Do you play?" A soft murmur moved through the crowd. Emily hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second. "A little," she answered, her voice calm, almost too calm. Richard let out a short laugh, glancing at the others. "A little," he repeated. "Well, that's perfect." He set his glass down with a quiet click. "Why don't you entertain us?" A few guests chuckled openly now. Someone whispered, "This should be good." Another added, "Hope she knows more than happy birthday." The manager, standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Richard's presence made silence the safer choice. Emily stood still, the tray still balanced in her hands. For a moment, it looked like she might decline, like she might apologize and step away. But something in her expression changed, so subtle most people missed it. Her shoulders relaxed. Her grip on the tray loosened. And when she set it down on the nearest table, she did so with a quiet precision that didn't belong to someone unsure. The room leaned in, not out of respect, but expectation, anticipating amusement, a harmless joke at someone else's expense. Richard leaned back slightly, satisfied, already enjoying the outcome he believed he had engineered. "Take your time," he added, his tone light, dismissive. Emily didn't respond. She simply turned toward the piano. Step by step, she crossed the room, her shoes making the faintest sound against the marble. Conversation softened. Laughter faded into whispers. And as she reached the bench, resting her fingers lightly on the polished edge, a strange, almost imperceptible stillness began to settle over the room, like something unseen had just shifted into place. Emily lowered herself onto the bench with a calmness that did not match the expectations hanging in the air, her fingers hovering just above the keys, as if greeting something familiar rather than confronting something new. And for a brief second the room held its breath in quiet anticipation, not out of respect but curiosity, the kind reserved for moments people expected to laugh about later. Richard leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the backrest, watching with a faint smirk as though he had already seen the ending of this little performance. His associates exchanging knowing glances, one of them whispering under his breath that this would be over in less than 30 seconds, while a woman at the next table discreetly lifted her phone, ready to capture what she assumed would be a harmless embarrassment. Emily's reflection shimmered faintly on the polished black surface of the piano lid, her expression steady, her breathing even, and then, without announcement or hesitation, her fingers descended onto the keys, and the first note rang out, clear, resonant, and impossibly precise, cutting cleanly through the low murmur of the room like a single beam of light through shadow. It was not loud, not dramatic, but it carried a weight that made conversation falter mid-sentence, a few heads turning more sharply now, brows knitting in subtle confusion as the second note followed, then the third, each one placed with deliberate control, forming a melody that did not belong to casual practice or hesitant familiarity, but to something far deeper, something practiced, something lived. Richard's smirk lingered for a moment longer, but there was a flicker behind his eyes, a hesitation he did not yet understand, as Emily's hands began to move with fluid confidence across the keyboard, the melody expanding, unfolding into something rich and layered, the kind of composition that demanded attention rather than invited it, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the laughter that had once filled the room dissolved into silence. A server carrying a tray paused mid-step, unsure whether to continue walking. A couple near the window stopped their conversation entirely, their heads turning toward the source of the sound, and even the faint clinking of glassware seemed to retreat into the background as the music grew more intricate, weaving emotion into every note. Emily's posture remained composed, her shoulders relaxed, her eyes focused not on the audience but somewhere beyond them, as if the room itself had ceased to exist, replaced by a memory only she could see, her fingers dancing across the keys with a precision that spoke of years, not moments, of dedication, and the shift in the atmosphere became undeniable. What had begun as a spectacle was transforming into something else entirely, something no one in the room had prepared for. Richard straightened slightly in his chair, the easy confidence in his posture tightening, his fingers curling around the edge of the table as his gaze fixed more intently on Emily, trying to reconcile the quiet waitress he had summoned with the musician now commanding the room without a single word. One of his associates leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper, asking if Richard knew about this. But Richard did not respond, his attention locked, his expression beginning to harden with something unfamiliar, something unspoken. The melody shifted. Again, rising with a subtle intensity, each note landing with exacting clarity, and the room responded in kind, the last remnants of casual noise fading into complete stillness. No phones lifted now, no whispers exchanged, only the sound of the piano filling the space where arrogance had once dominated. And in that growing silence, something else settled in, something heavier than embarrassment, something closer to realization. Though no one had yet found the words to name it, Emily did not look up, did not acknowledge the change. She simply continued, her hands moving with quiet authority, each movement effortless, each phrase unfolding like a story that had been waiting far longer than this moment to be told. And as the final notes of the passage approached, there was a tension in the air, not of ridicule, but anticipation, the kind that precedes something irreversible, something that cannot be undone once revealed. And for the first time that evening, Richard Hawthorne was no longer the center of the room. He was simply a man watching, silent, as control slipped from his grasp one note at a time. The final note did not end so much as it dissolved, lingering in the air like something unwilling to leave. And for a long moment no one moved, no one spoke. The entire room suspended in a silence so complete it felt almost tangible, as if even the walls themselves were listening. Emily's fingers rested lightly on the keys, not trembling, not hesitant, simply still, and when she finally lifted her hands away, the absence of sound seemed louder than anything that had come before it. Somewhere near the back, a glass shifted against a table with a faint clink that echoed far more than it should have, breaking the spell just enough for reality to begin creeping back in. But even then, no laughter returned, no smirks reappeared, only a quiet, collective awareness that something had just changed. Richard Hawthorne sat frozen, his posture rigid now, the easy arrogance that had defined him only minutes earlier replaced by a tension he could not disguise, his gaze fixed on Emily as if searching for an explanation that refused to present itself, his lips parting slightly as though he might speak, but no words followed, not yet, not while the weight of what he had witnessed settled into place. One of his associates cleared his throat softly, glancing around the room as if expecting someone else to restore the atmosphere, but no one stepped forward, no one dared to interrupt the moment, because whatever had just happened was not meant to be dismissed or laughed away. It demanded acknowledgement, even if no one was prepared to give it. Emily rose from the bench with the same quiet composure she had carried all evening, smoothing her uniform with a small, almost absent gesture, her expression unchanged, neither proud nor apologetic, simply calm, as if she had done nothing extraordinary at all, and that, more than anything, unsettled the room. She turned slightly, her eyes passing briefly over the crowd, not searching for approval, not seeking validation, but observing, and for the first time, those who met her gaze felt something unfamiliar, not pity, not dismissal, but a subtle discomfort, the realization that they had misjudged something fundamental. Richard finally shifted, pushing himself upright in his chair, the movement sharper than intended, drawing a few glances in his direction, but he ignored them, his attention still locked on Emily as she stepped away from the piano, his voice finding its way out at last, quieter than anyone had ever heard it, stripped of its usual authority. "Wait," he said, the single word carrying less command and more uncertainty than he would have liked. Emily paused, turning just enough to acknowledge him, her posture straight, her presence steady, and for a brief moment the entire room seemed to lean in. Again, waiting, not for entertainment this time, but for understanding. Richard hesitated, the question forming in his mind refusing to take shape on his lips, because asking it would mean admitting something he had never been forced to confront, that he had been wrong, profoundly, publicly wrong, and yet the silence demanded something, anything, to fill it. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he finally asked, the words measured, careful, as if choosing them incorrectly might shatter whatever fragile balance remained. Emily regarded him for a moment, her eyes steady, unreadable, and when she answered, her voice was soft, but it carried clearly through the stillness. "I never stopped," she said, the simplicity of the statement landing heavier than any explanation could have, leaving behind more questions than answers, and before anyone could respond, before the moment could shift again, she turned fully and began to walk away, her steps quiet against the marble floor, the same as they had always been. But now, every eye followed her, not out of curiosity, but something closer to respect, something earned without a single demand. Behind her, Richard remained standing, the room no longer orbiting him, the power he had so casually exercised earlier now feeling distant, diminished, and as the silence lingered, stretching longer than anyone found comfortable, one truth settled quietly into the space, undeniable and unspoken, that in trying to make a spectacle of someone he believed beneath him, he had instead revealed something about himself that no amount of wealth could conceal. And for the first time that evening, it was not Emily who felt exposed, it was him. Emily did not rush as she moved away from the piano, her steps steady, her presence unchanged, yet the atmosphere behind her shifted in a way that could not be undone. Conversations did not resume the way they had before, laughter did not return with the same ease, and even the soft music that usually filled the restaurant seemed hesitant to reclaim its place, as though it understood it had just been replaced by something far more real. The manager, who had earlier stood silent under the weight of Richard's authority, now watched Emily with a different expression, one that mixed disbelief with a quiet respect he could not quite articulate, his hands clasped in front of him, as if unsure whether to intervene or simply observe the unfolding consequences of a moment that had slipped beyond anyone's control. At the center of the room, Richard remained standing, his posture no longer relaxed. His usual composure fractured in small but noticeable ways, his fingers adjusting the cuff of his sleeve not out of habit but discomfort, his gaze following Emily as she returned to her duties, picking up a tray as though nothing had happened, as though she had not just shifted the balance of the entire room with a few minutes of music. One of his associates leaned closer, his voice low but urgent, asking if Richard had known about her, if this had been some kind of arrangement, but Richard did not answer. Because the truth was far simpler and far more unsettling. He had not known, and, worse, he had not thought it possible. Across the room, a woman who had earlier laughed quietly now lowered her eyes, her expression thoughtful, as if reconsidering not just what she had seen, but how quickly she had joined in judgment. And beside her, a man who had been ready to record the moment now slipped his phone back into his pocket, the screen dark and used, as though capturing what had happened would have felt inappropriate, even disrespectful. Emily approached a table near the window, setting down a glass of water with the same gentle precision she had shown all evening, her voice calm as she asked if there was anything else they needed. And the couple seated there, who only minutes ago had barely acknowledged her, now responded differently, their tone softer, their words more deliberate, as if speaking to someone they finally recognized as more than just a background presence. Richard exhaled slowly, the breath heavier than he intended, and for the first time that evening, he became aware of the eyes that were no longer drawn to him, the conversations that no longer depended on his approval, the subtle shift of attention that had moved elsewhere, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. He reached for his glass, lifting it halfway before setting it back down untouched, the gesture incomplete, mirroring the unfinished certainty he had carried into the night. And after a moment, he stepped forward, not with the commanding stride that had once defined him, but with something more measured, more cautious, as if each step required consideration. He stopped a few feet from Emily as she stood near the service station, organizing utensils with quiet efficiency, and for a brief moment he said nothing, the words he had used so easily earlier now refusing to come, because none of them seemed appropriate anymore. Not the jokes, not the dismissive remarks, not the casual authority he had relied on for so long. Emily, he said finally, her name sounding unfamiliar on his tongue, stripped of its earlier context, and she looked up, meeting his gaze without hesitation, without challenge, simply present. There was no tension in her expression, no trace of resentment. Only a calm steadiness that made his next words feel heavier than they should have been. I did not expect that, he admitted, the statement understated, insufficient, but honest in a way that surprised even him. Emily held his gaze for a moment, then nodded slightly, not in agreement, not in validation, but acknowledgement, as if she had heard this kind of realization before, in different forms, from different people. Most people do not. She replied quietly, her tone neither sharp nor forgiving, simply factual, and in that moment, the distance between them was no longer defined by status or wealth, but by understanding, or the lack of it. Richard opened his mouth as if to say more, perhaps to explain, perhaps to recover some measure of control, but no words followed, because there was nothing he could add that would restore what had been lost or undo what had been revealed. And as he stood there, the silence returned once more, not as heavy as before, but just as clear, a quiet reminder that respect, once demanded without reason, could not be reclaimed without humility. Richard stood there a moment longer, as if waiting for something to shift back into place, for the room to return to the version of itself he understood, but it did not, and the longer he remained silent, the more obvious it became that whatever authority he had carried into the evening no longer held the same weight. Emily had already returned to her routine, moving between tables with quiet efficiency, her presence no longer invisible, yet not demanding attention either, simply existing with a calm certainty that made everything around her feel slightly different, as though the room itself had been recalibrated. A man seated near the center of the dining hall slowly began to clap, a single, measured sound that broke through the lingering stillness, and for a brief second it seemed uncertain whether anyone would follow. But then another joined, and another, until the applause spread across the room, not loud or exaggerated, but genuine, steady, and unmistakably respectful, the kind of reaction that could not be staged or forced. Emily paused when she heard it, turning slightly, her expression composed, her eyes scanning the room not for validation but acknowledgement, and for a moment she inclined her head just enough to recognize the gesture before continuing on, as if applause was not something she needed to hold on to. Richard watched this unfold with a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with realization, because the applause was not for him, not influenced by him, not dependent on him, and that absence felt louder than any recognition he had ever received. One of his associates shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his tie as he leaned closer, his voice low, asking if Richard wanted to say something, perhaps to address the room, to reclaim control. But Richard remained still, because there was nothing he could say that would not sound hollow in comparison to what had just happened without words. Across the dining hall, the manager finally stepped forward, his posture more confident now, approaching Emily with a respectful nod, speaking to her quietly, but with a tone that carried a different kind of acknowledgement, one that suggested he understood, at least in part, what the room had just witnessed, and Emily listened, nodding once before, responding in a calm voice, her words too soft to carry, but her composure unmistakable. Richard exhaled slowly and reached for his jacket, slipping it on with deliberate care, not as a display, but as a quiet signal that his evening, at least in the way he had intended it, was over, and as he adjusted the collar, he glanced around the room one last time, noticing the subtle shifts that had taken place, the conversations that had resumed, but with a different tone, the way people looked at Emily when she passed, the way they spoke to her now, and more importantly, the way they no longer looked to him as the center of everything. He took a step toward the exit, his movements measured, and as he passed by the piano, he slowed just slightly, his gaze lingering on the keys, the same keys he had turned into a stage for mockery only minutes earlier, now carrying the memory of something far more meaningful, and for the first time, he understood that the moment had not been about entertainment at all. It had been about exposure, not hers, but his. Near the door, he paused, glancing back once more, his eyes finding Emily across the room as she set down another glass, her posture steady, her presence unchanged. And in that brief exchange of distance, something unspoken passed between them. Not forgiveness, not confrontation, but clarity, a quiet acknowledgement of what had been revealed and what could not be undone. Richard gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, before turning and stepping out into the cool night air, the door closing softly behind him, leaving the warmth of the dining hall and the weight of the evening on the other side. Inside, the room continued, but not as it had before, because something had shifted in a way that could not be reversed, and though no one said it aloud, though no formal lesson was spoken, the truth settled into the space just the same, that dignity does not announce itself, it does not demand attention, but when it reveals itself, even for a moment, it changes everything, and those who witness it are never quite the same again. The night air outside had grown cooler, but inside the dining hall, something warmer and quieter had taken its place, a kind of unspoken awareness that lingered between conversations, shaping the way people spoke, the way they listened, and most of all, the way they looked at Emily Carter as she moved through the room with the same quiet grace she had always carried. Yet now, every step she took seemed to leave an impression, not loud or dramatic, but undeniable, as if the space itself had recalibrated around her presence. The piano remained where it was, untouched once more, but no longer overlooked, its glossy surface now holding the memory of something that had shifted the entire room, and every so often, someone would glance toward it, not out of curiosity, but reflection. At a corner table, a man who had earlier laughed the loudest now spoke more softly, his tone measured, his posture slightly more reserved, as though the evening had introduced him to a version of himself he had not expected to meet, and beside him, a woman nodded thoughtfully, her gaze following Emily for a moment before returning to her plate, her expression no longer casual, but contemplative. Near the center of the room, the manager adjusted his stance, his attention sharper now, his respect more intentional, as He watched Emily handle a busy section with calm efficiency, his earlier hesitation replaced with quiet admiration, and when their eyes met briefly, he gave a small nod, not as a superior, but as someone acknowledging something he had nearly overlooked. Emily, for her part, did not change. She did not slow her pace or seek acknowledgement. She did not revisit the piano or draw attention to what had happened. She simply continued, her movement steady, her voice soft yet clear when she spoke to guests, her presence grounded in something that did not require validation. But beneath that calm exterior, there was a depth, a quiet history that lingered just beneath the surface, hinted at in the way her fingers had moved across the keys, in the way she had not hesitated when called upon, in the way she had returned to her work without a trace of pride or resentment. And though no one in the room knew the full story, they felt it, in fragments, in impressions, in the undeniable sense that the woman they had overlooked carried something far greater than the role they had assigned her. As the evening continued, a subtle transformation unfolded, not in grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but in small, meaningful shifts, a guest standing as Emily approached, offering a quiet thank you, another asking her opinion on the menu with genuine interest, a third pausing before speaking, as if choosing words more carefully than before. These were not acts of obligation, but of recognition, and though they may have seemed minor, they carried a weight that extended beyond the moment. In the far corner, the piano remained still, its silence now carrying more meaning than sound ever could, a quiet reminder of what had been revealed, and of how quickly perception could change when truth was allowed to surface. As the hours passed, and the crowd slowly thinned, the energy of the room softened, settling into something calmer, more grounded, and when Emily finally stepped into the service corridor for a brief moment of rest, the noise of the dining hall fading behind her, she allowed herself a single breath, deeper than the ones she had taken all evening, her shoulders relaxing just slightly, her eyes closing for a brief second as if acknowledging something only she could feel. There was no smile, no visible satisfaction, only a quiet stillness, the kind that comes not from proving something to others, but from knowing something within oneself. And when she opened her eyes again, the same calm presence returned, as if nothing had changed at all, though everything had. Outside, the city continued as it always did, lights glowing, traffic moving, people passing without, knowing what had unfolded inside those walls, unaware that for a brief moment, in a room built on status and perception, something far more meaningful had taken place, something that did not announce itself, did not demand attention, but left behind a lasting imprint just the same, a quiet reminder that dignity does not need to be proven, it only needs to be revealed, and once it is, it cannot be unseen. By the time the last few tables began to clear and the soft glow of the chandeliers dimmed slightly to signal the end of the evening, the dining hall no longer felt like the same place it had been just a few hours earlier, not because anything visible had changed, but because something beneath the surface had shifted in a way that could not be reset. The staff moved with the same routines, the same polished efficiency. But there was a subtle awareness now, a quiet attentiveness in how they interacted, how they carried themselves, as if they had all witnessed something that quietly redefined the meaning of presence. Emily stepped back onto the floor after her brief pause, her posture as composed as ever, her expression calm. Yet there was a faint softness in her eyes, not from pride, but from a kind of internal stillness, the kind that comes from having nothing left to prove. She resumed her duties without hesitation, collecting empty glasses, offering polite smiles, thanking guests as they prepared to leave, and one by one, those guests responded differently than they had before, their voices more sincere, their words more thoughtful, some even pausing just a moment longer than necessary, as if trying to find the right way to acknowledge something they did not fully understand, but deeply respected. Near the entrance, a couple who had been seated close to the piano approached her directly, the man clearing his throat slightly before speaking, his tone careful, respectful, asking if she had ever performed professionally, and Emily, without hesitation, simply shook her head with a small smile. "Not anymore," she replied, her answer brief, but layered with meaning that invited no further questions. The woman beside him nodded slowly, her expression softening as she thanked Emily again, not just for the service, but for the evening itself, and when they left, they did so with one last glance back toward the piano, as if carrying the moment with them. In the distance, the manager stood observing quietly, his earlier authority now replaced with something closer to humility, and as Emily passed by him, he spoke her name again, this time without hesitation, his voice steady, offering her a sincere compliment on her performance, but more importantly, thanking her, not just for what she had done, but for how she had handled it. And Emily listened, nodding once, her response simple. "I was just doing what I know," she said, her tone gentle, unassuming, and that simplicity seemed to resonate more than anything else. As the night drew closer to its end, the remaining staff began preparing for closing, stacking chairs, resetting tables, moving with a quiet rhythm that felt almost reflective, and through it all, the piano remained untouched, no one daring to approach it casually, no one willing to reduce it back to decoration, because it now carried something more, something intangible but deeply felt. Emily finished her final table and stepped back once more, her gaze drifting briefly toward the instrument, and for a moment, just a moment, something flickered across her face, not regret, not longing, but recognition, as if acknowledging a part of herself that had never truly left, only waited patiently beneath the surface. She did not move toward it, did not play again, because she did not need to. The moment had already spoken for itself. Outside, the city lights reflected softly against the windows, casting gentle patterns across the polished floor, and as the last guest exited and the doors closed behind them, the room settled into a quiet stillness that felt earned, not empty. Emily removed her apron slowly, folding it neatly, placing it aside with the same care she gave to everything she did. And as she prepared to leave, she paused near the piano one final time, her fingers brushing lightly against its edge, not to play, but to acknowledge, and then she turned away, her steps as quiet as ever, her presence once again blending into the background, but no longer unseen, because now, even in her silence, the room remembered, and in that memory, something lasting remained, a quiet understanding that greatness does not always arrive with announcement or recognition, but when it reveals itself, even briefly, it leaves behind a truth that lingers far beyond the moment itself. The lights dimmed a little further as closing time approached, and one by one, the final staff members finished their duties, their movements quieter now, more deliberate, as if the night had left something behind that none of them wanted to disturb. The dining hall, once filled with layered conversations and confident laughter, now rested in a calm stillness, the kind that follows something meaningful, something that lingers long after it is over. Emily stepped toward the back exit, her coat folded neatly over her arm, her pace unhurried, and just as she reached for the handle, a voice called out behind her, not loud, but clear enough to stop her mid-step. "Emily," the manager said, approaching with a measured stride. His usual authority softened into something more grounded, more human. She turned, her expression calm, waiting, and for a moment he seemed to search for the right words, as though the usual language of supervision and instruction no longer applied. "You did not just play well tonight," he said finally, his voice steady but sincere. "You changed the way this place felt," and the honesty in his tone carried more weight than any compliment could have. Emily listened, her eyes steady, and then gave a small nod, not dismissing his words, but not holding on to them either. "Thank you," she replied softly, her voice carrying the same quiet balance she had shown all evening, and with that, she turned back toward the door, stepping out into the cool night air where the city stretched out in quiet contrast to the elegance she had just left behind. The streetlights cast a gentle glow across the sidewalk, cars passing at a steady rhythm, the distant hum of the city continuing as it always did, unaware of the shift that had taken place inside those walls. Emily walked a few steps, her breath visible for a moment. In the cool air, her shoulders relaxing slightly as she moved away from the space that had, for a brief time, asked her to reveal something she had long kept private. Behind her, inside the restaurant, the manager stood for a moment longer, his gaze drifting toward the piano, its presence now carrying a quiet significance that he knew would not fade easily. And as he turned off the final set of lights, he understood that tomorrow, the room would look the same, the tables arranged, the glasses polished, the piano still in its place, but it would not feel the same, not to him, and not to anyone who had been there. Across town, Richard Hawthorne sat alone in the back seat of his car, the city lights passing by in blurred reflections against the window, his posture no longer relaxed, his thoughts moving slower than usual, as if each one carried more weight than he was accustomed to. His driver asked a question about the route, but Richard did not respond immediately, his attention fixed. Somewhere beyond the glass, replaying the moment not as it had looked, but as it had felt, the silence, the shift, the realization that had arrived without warning and refused to leave. He had spent years building a life where control was constant, where perception could be shaped and outcomes predicted, but tonight had been different. Tonight had not followed his script, and that difference lingered. He exhaled quietly, adjusting his cuff again, a habit that no longer grounded him the way it once had, and for the first time in a long while, he found himself not reaching for a solution, not trying to fix or control the outcome, but simply sitting with it, with the awareness that something he had overlooked had revealed more than he had intended. Back on the street, Emily continued walking, her steps steady, her path familiar, and though nothing about her surroundings had changed, something within her had settled, not in triumph, not in relief, but in quiet alignment, the kind that does not depend on recognition or approval. She passed by a small storefront with a darkened window, her reflection briefly visible, and for a moment she slowed, her gaze meeting her own, not searching, not questioning, just acknowledging. Before continuing on, the night carried on around her, the rhythm of the city unchanged, but beneath it all, something remained, something subtle yet lasting, a reminder that moments of truth do not need an audience to matter, and that sometimes, the most powerful shifts happen not in what is said or shown, but in what is quietly understood, long after the room has gone silent. The following morning arrived without announcement, just a gradual shift of light through the city, the same streets waking up to the same routines, unaware that for some, the night before had quietly rewritten something deeper than habit. Inside the dining hall, the early staff moved through preparation with practiced rhythm, polishing glasses, aligning chairs, adjusting table settings with the same precision as always. Yet beneath that routine, there was a subtle difference, an awareness that lingered from the evening before, not spoken, but present in the way they glanced toward the piano, in the way they carried themselves with just a little more intention. The manager arrived earlier than usual, stepping inside with a quiet pause as his eyes moved across the room, taking in the familiar layout, the untouched elegance, and yet feeling the shift that could not be seen, only remembered. He walked slowly toward the piano, stopping a few feet away, his gaze resting on the keys, not as decoration, but as something that now held meaning. And for a moment he simply stood there, as if acknowledging a truth that had revealed itself without permission, one that could not be ignored again. Across town, Richard Hawthorne sat in his office, the wide windows framing the skyline as sunlight stretched across polished surfaces, everything in its place, everything controlled. Yet his focus was elsewhere, his thoughts returning again and again to a moment he had not planned, could not predict, and had not been able to undo. A file sat open in front of him, unread, his hand resting against the edge of his desk, his usual sharp attention softened into something more reflective, more measured. And when his assistant stepped in to confirm his morning schedule, he responded with a simple nod, his voice quieter than usual, his tone lacking the familiar edge of command. The day moved forward, meetings held, calls made, decisions executed. But beneath it all, something remained unsettled, not in a disruptive way, but in a way that refused to be dismissed, like a note that continued to resonate long after the music had ended. Back at the restaurant, the doors opened once more to a new wave of guests, unaware, unconnected to the night before their conversations filling the space, their expectations shaped by the same assumptions that had once defined the room. And yet, when Emily Carter stepped onto the floor, her presence carried a quiet difference, not in appearance, not in action, but in perception, because those who had witnessed her before saw her differently now, and even those who had not seemed to respond to something unspoken in the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she held herself with calm certainty. The piano remained still, but no longer unnoticed, and though no one approached it, its presence lingered like a memory woven into the room itself. As the evening unfolded, a man seated near the center of the dining hall glanced toward Emily more than once, his expression thoughtful, and finally, when she approached his table, he asked a simple question, his tone respectful. "Do you ever play here?" And Emily paused for just a moment before answering, her voice soft but steady. "Only when it matters." And there was something in her answer that settled into the air, not as a performance, not as a statement, but as truth. The man nodded slowly, understanding more than the words themselves conveyed, and as Emily stepped away, the room continued, conversations rising and falling, the rhythm of the evening unfolding as it always did, but with something beneath it, something subtle yet lasting. Across the city, Richard paused at the edge of a decision he would not have considered before, his hand resting on his phone, his thoughts measured, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to acknowledge what had changed, not in the world around him, but within himself. The understanding that influence without awareness carried no real weight, and that respect, once assumed, had to be earned in ways he had never truly considered. He set the phone down without making the call, not because he had resolved everything, but because for the first time, he understood that not everything needed to be controlled. Some things needed to be understood first. And back in the dining hall, as the evening settled into its steady rhythm, the memory of what had happened did not fade. It remained, quiet but present, shaping the space in ways that could not be measured, reminding those who had witnessed it, and even those who had not, that dignity does not need to announce itself. It does not demand recognition, but when it reveals itself, even for a moment, it leaves behind a truth that lingers far beyond the silence that follows. And on that day, without applause, without spectacle, the world, in its own quiet way, remembered what dignity looks like.